The phone screen trembled in Maria Santos's weathered hands as she pressed record, her breath catching in her throat like broken glass. 20 feet away, two HOA enforcement officers had 73-year-old Theodore Harris pinned face down in his own rose garden. The thorns he'd spent decades nurturing now piercing his weathered cheek as Officer Bradley Mitchell pressed a knee against his spine. "Please, stop." Theodore's voice cracked through the humid afternoon air, each word a desperate prayer that fell on deaf ears. "I wasn't doing anything wrong." The electric crackle of the taser filled the suburban silence like thunder before the storm. Theodore's body convulsed against the earth he'd tended with such devotion, his fingers clawing at the soil where his prize-winning roses had bloomed just hours before. Maria's thumb never left the record button, even as tears blurred her vision and her heart hammered against her ribs like a caged bird. She knew, with the terrible certainty that comes with witnessing the unthinkable, that she was recording a man's final moments. Theodore Harris had been watering his roses when the trouble began. The morning sun cast long shadows across Willowbrook Gardens, the upscale planned community where he'd lived for 15 years since retiring from his position as principal at Martin Luther King Jr. Elementary School. His hands, still steady despite his age, guided the garden hose with the precision of someone who understood that nurturing required patience. The Mr. Lincoln roses were his pride, their deep red blooms a testament to years of careful cultivation and love. "Beautiful morning for gardening, isn't it, Mr. Harris?" called out Jennifer Kim from her adjacent yard, where she was deadheading her own flower beds. At 62, Jennifer had become Theodore's closest friend in the neighborhood since her husband's passing 2 years prior. They shared a love of gardening and an understanding of the particular loneliness that came with aging in a community designed for younger families. "Indeed it is, Jennifer," Theodore replied, his voice carrying the measured cadence of 3 decades spent teaching children. "The roses are responding beautifully to this morning routine. I believe we'll have our best season yet." He adjusted his worn Cardinals baseball cap, a gift from his son Marcus during their last visit together. The brim cast shadows over eyes that had seen too much history, yet still sparkled with the joy he found in simple pleasures. The tranquility shattered at precisely 9:47 a.m., when the white HOA enforcement vehicle turned onto Maple Street with the aggressive rumble of an engine pushed too hard. Officer Bradley Mitchell, a 42-year-old former mall security guard who'd found purpose in the authority that came with his HOA badge, scanned the neighborhood like a predator seeking prey. His partner, Officer Derek Chen, 28, and fresh from a community college criminal justice program, gripped the steering wheel with the nervous energy of someone desperate to prove himself worthy of respect. "There," Mitchell pointed through the windshield, his voice sharp with the satisfaction of discovery. "Noise violation in progress. Water's been running for more than 30 minutes. That's against Section 12B of the Community Guidelines." His interpretation of the rules had grown increasingly creative since his promotion to lead enforcement officer 6 months prior. Each violation a small victory in his war against what he perceived as neighborhood chaos. Theodore heard the vehicle doors slam with the metallic finality of prison gates closing. He turned slowly, his movements deliberate and non-threatening, to see the 2 officers approaching with the swagger of men convinced of their own authority. Mitchell's hand already rested on the taser holstered at his hip, a gesture that made Theodore's stomach tighten with familiar dread. "Sir, you're in violation of community water usage regulations," Mitchell announced, his voice carrying across the morning air with the pompous authority of someone drunk on minimal power. "Turn off that hose immediately and prepare to receive a citation." He pulled out a leather-bound citation book with the theatrical flourish of a gunslinger drawing his weapon. Theodore blinked in confusion, his hand instinctively tightening around the garden hose. "I'm sorry, officers, but I'm not familiar with any 30-minute limit. I've been watering my garden this way for 15 years without any issues. Perhaps there's been a misunderstanding." His voice remained calm, measured. The tone he'd perfected during countless difficult conversations with upset parents and frustrated school board members. "No misunderstanding here, old man," Chen interjected, stepping closer with the jerky movements of someone high on newfound authority. "Rules are rules. You think you can just do whatever you want because you've been here a long time." The contempt in his voice was thick as motor oil, coating each word with dismissive hatred. Jennifer Kim watched the confrontation unfold from her kitchen window, her coffee mug forgotten in her hands, as unease settled in her stomach like a stone. She'd witnessed enough of these encounters to recognize the dangerous trajectory. Mitchell and Chen had been escalating their enforcement tactics for months, turning minor infractions into major confrontations with the systematic precision of bullies who discovered their playground. "Gentlemen, I'm happy to comply with any regulations," Theodore said, his voice carrying the diplomatic patience he'd learned from decades of de-escalating tense situations. "Could you please show me where this 30-minute rule is written? I'd like to review it so I can ensure compliance in the future." He reached slowly toward his back pocket for his reading glasses, the movement as innocent as sunrise. The reaction was immediate and violent. "He's going for a weapon!" Chen shouted, his voice cracking with artificial fear and genuine excitement. Both officers lunged forward with the coordinated aggression of wolves bringing down prey, their movements speaking to hours of tactical training misapplied to situations that required nothing more than basic human decency. Theodore's glasses flew from his hand as Mitchell's shoulder drove into his chest, sending the elderly man stumbling backward into his beloved rose bushes. The thorns caught his cardigan, tearing the fabric his late wife had mended countless times with fingers made tender by love and arthritis. "Wait, please," he gasped, his hands raised in surrender. But his words were lost in the chaos of commands being shouted by men who had already decided his guilt. Maria Santos emerged from her house with the laundry basket balanced on her hip, drawn by the commotion that had shattered the morning peace. What she saw made her blood turn to ice water in her veins. Theodore Harris, a man who had taught her own daughter to read during summer tutoring sessions, was being forced to his knees by two officers whose faces were flushed with the ugly excitement of violence about to be unleashed. "Get down on the ground! Get down now!" Mitchell's voice had risen to a hysterical pitch, as if he were commanding a dangerous criminal rather than a man old enough to be his father. The taser appeared in his hand with practiced ease, its yellow plastic body gleaming in the morning sun, like a poisonous insect preparing to strike. Theodore's knees hit the soft earth with a sound that made Maria's heart break. Soil that had been lovingly cultivated for years now received the weight of a good man brought low by hatred and stupidity. "I'm complying," he said, his voice steady despite the tremor in his hands. "Please, I'm complying with your instructions." Jennifer Kim burst through her back door, her house slippers slapping against the concrete patio as she ran toward the fence that separated their properties. "Stop this immediately!" she shouted, her voice carrying the authority of a woman who had spent 30 years as the emergency room nurse. "He was just watering his garden. This is insane." Her words cut through the morning air with surgical precision, but they might as well have been spoken in a foreign language for all the impact they had on the unfolding brutality. Other neighbors began emerging from their homes, drawn by the sound of shouting and the terrible magnetic pull of witnessing injustice. Mrs. Patterson from 3 houses down clutched her pearls with one hand and her phone with the other, her finger hovering over the emergency call button as her privileged mind struggled to process what her eyes were seeing. Tom Bradley from across the street stepped onto his porch, but came no closer, his face a mask of conflicted emotions and cowardly self-preservation. Maria's phone was in her hand before conscious thought directed the action. her thumb finding the record button, with the instinct of someone who understood that truth must be captured before it could be twisted by those in power. The screen filled with the image of Theodore Harris face down in his garden. Mitchell's knee pressed against his spine with the casual brutality of someone enjoying their work. "You're recording this." Chen noticed Maria's phone, and his face contorted with rage and something that might have been fear. "Put that down, or you'll be arrested for interfering with official business." His voice cracked on the threat, revealing the insecurity that lurked beneath his manufactured authority. "This is official business." Maria's voice was steady, despite the adrenaline coursing through her system like liquid fire. "Beating an old man for watering his flowers." She held the phone higher, making sure the angle captured both officers' faces and Theodore's prone form with documentary precision. Mitchell's response was to increase the pressure on Theodore's spine, grinding the elderly man's face deeper into the soil he'd nurtured with such love. Resisting arrest and failure to comply with lawful orders, he announced to the growing crowd of neighbors, his voice carrying the rehearsed authority of someone who had practiced these words in front of a mirror. Subject refused to turn off water source and reached for what appeared to be a weapon. Theodore's muffled voice rose from the earth like a prayer from a grave. "My glasses. I was reaching for my reading glasses." Each word was a struggle against the weight pressing down on his lungs, against the thorns piercing his cheek, against the crushing realization that his skin color had transformed a simple misunderstanding into a life-threatening encounter. The taser fired with a sound like electricity tearing through fabric. Theodore's body went rigid, every muscle contracting in agony as 50,000 volts coursed through his system. His hands clawed at the soil, dirt packing under his fingernails as his nervous system betrayed him. Maria's camera captured every second, every convulsion, every detail of state-sanctioned torture being administered in broad daylight on a quiet suburban street. "Stop! He has a heart condition!" Jennifer's scream cut through the air like a siren, but her medical knowledge only seemed to encourage the officer's brutality. Mitchell's face was flushed with excitement, his breathing heavy as he watched Theodore's body jerk against the electrical current. This was power in its purest form, the ability to cause pain without consequence, to exercise authority without accountability. Shen drew his own taser, the redundancy of the gesture speaking to either complete tactical ignorance or sadistic overkill. "Subject is still resisting," he announced to no one in particular, his voice high with manufactured excitement. The electricity crackled again, and Theodore's body arched like a bowstring pulled too tight, his aged heart struggling against the artificial stimulation that threatened to stop it entirely. The crowd of neighbors had grown to nearly 20 people, their faces a mixture of horror, disbelief, and the kind of fascinated paralysis that comes with witnessing the unthinkable. Some held phones, capturing evidence that would later flood social media and news broadcasts. Others simply stood frozen, their comfortable assumptions about justice and order crumbling like sandcastles before a tsunami of reality. Maria kept recording even as tears streamed down her face. Even as her hands shook with rage and helplessness, she understood, with the terrible clarity that comes in moments of crisis, that Theodore Harris was dying in front of her, that two men with badges were committing murder in broad daylight, and that the only thing standing between truth and fabrication was the camera in her trembling hands. Theodore's voice was barely a whisper now, his words carried away by the morning breeze that still smelled of roses and fresh earth. "Please. I can't breathe. Please." His fingers, which had graded thousands of papers and guided countless young hands in learning to write their names, now clawed desperately at the soil as his oxygen-starved brain began to shut down. The sound of screeching tires cut through the morning air like a sword through silk. A black Ford Mustang took the corner onto Maple Street, with the controlled aggression of a driver who understood exactly how much speed the vehicle could handle. The car's engine note dropped to a predatory growl as it approached the scene, its driver taking in the situation with the rapid assessment skills of someone trained to evaluate threats and respond accordingly. The Mustang stopped with precision that spoke to military training, its front bumper exactly 18 inches from Chen's patrol vehicle. The driver's door opened with mechanical efficiency, and a figure emerged that seemed to change the very atmosphere of the confrontation. Marcus Harris stood 6 feet, 2 inches tall, his frame carrying the lean muscle of someone who had turned physical fitness into a religion. His civilian clothes, jeans, and a simple polo shirt did nothing to disguise the predatory grace with which he moved, or the cold intelligence that burned in his dark eyes. Marcus had been returning from a grocery run, planning to surprise his father with the ingredients for the Sunday dinner they'd shared every week since his mother's passing 3 years ago. The sight that greeted him defied comprehension, challenged every assumption he'd made about safety and order in the suburban community where he'd grown up. His father, the man who had taught him about dignity and strength and the importance of education, was face down in dirt with 2 officers administering what could only be described as torture. The transformation that came over Marcus Harris was visible to everyone present, a shift from concerned son to something far more dangerous. 23 years of military service, including 15 years with the Army's elite Delta Force, had taught him to compartmentalize emotion, to channel rage into precise action. His movements, as he approached the scene, carried the fluid menace of an apex predator, each step calculated for maximum psychological impact. Release him. Now. Marcus's voice cut through the chaos with the authority of someone who had commanded men in life and death situations on 3 continents. There was no emotion in his tone, no pleading or negotiation. Just the simple statement of fact delivered by someone accustomed to immediate obedience. Mitchell looked up from his position over Theodore's prone form, his face flushed with exertion and sadistic pleasure. The sight of Marcus Harris should have given him pause, should have triggered some primitive survival instinct that warned of imminent danger. Instead, intoxicated by his own authority and the power he'd been exercising, he chose to escalate rather than de-escalate. "Sir, you need to step back immediately, or you'll be arrested for interfering with police business," Mitchell announced, his voice carrying the same pompous authority he'd used on Theodore. His hand moved toward his taser, a gesture that, in any other context, might have seemed threatening, but now appeared almost comically inadequate. Marcus stopped exactly 6 feet away from the officers, his posture relaxed but ready, his hands visible but positioned for rapid movement. His eyes, which neighbors would later describe as containing something that made them physically uncomfortable to meet, never left Theodore's still form. "That man is my father," he said, his voice carrying across the silent street with perfect clarity. "You have 30 seconds to remove your hands from him before I remove them for you." The crowd of neighbors found themselves holding their breath, sensing that they were witnessing a moment that would be remembered and retold for years to come. Jennifer Kim, still clutching her phone, recognized something in Marcus's bearing that made her step instinctively backward. This was not a man making empty threats. This was a predator evaluating prey and finding them wanting. Chen, younger and perhaps more attuned to subtle threats than his partner, felt the first stirrings of genuine fear. Something in Marcus's stillness, in the way he stood perfectly balanced on the balls of his feet, triggered every survival instinct Chen possessed. But Mitchell, drunk on authority and convinced of his own invincibility, chose confrontation over wisdom. "This subject is under arrest for resisting arrest and assaulting an officer," Mitchell announced, pressing his knee harder against Theodore's spine for emphasis. "You can join him if you don't back off right now." His hand closed around his taser, drawing it with the flourish of someone who believed the weapon made him invincible. Marcus's response was so swift that most witnesses would later struggle to describe exactly what they had seen. One moment, he was standing 6 feet away with his hands visible. The next, Mitchell was face down on the ground with his arm twisted behind his back, in a position that suggested immediate compliance, or immediate breakage. The taser flew through the air, landing harmlessly in Theodore's rose bushes with a soft thud that seemed disproportionately loud in the sudden silence. Chen reached for his own weapon, but found his wrist caught in a grip that felt like a steel vise. Marcus's other hand pressed against specific pressure points in Chen's neck, causing the younger officer to see stars and question every life choice that had led him to this moment. "Do not reach for your weapon," Marcus said conversationally, as if discussing the weather rather than demonstrating his ability to render both officers unconscious without visible effort. Theodore Harris lay motionless in the soil, his breathing shallow and irregular. The electrical shock from the tasers had stressed his 73-year-old heart beyond its limits, and the sustained pressure on his chest had restricted oxygen flow to dangerous levels. Marcus, still maintaining control of both officers with the casual efficiency of long practice, called out instructions without taking his eyes off their subdued forms. "Maria, call 911 and request both police and paramedics," he said, his voice carrying the calm authority of someone accustomed to managing chaos. "Tell them we have an elderly man in cardiac distress and 2 officers who require immediate medical evaluation for potential head injuries." The threat was delivered with such professional courtesy that it took several seconds for its implications to register. Jennifer Kim dropped to her knees beside Theodore, her nursing training overriding her shock as she began assessing his vital signs. His pulse was rapid and irregular, his breathing labored, his skin taking on the grayish pallor that she had seen too many times in the emergency room. "Marcus, his heart is in distress," she called out, her voice tight with professional concern. "I think he's having arrhythmia from the electrical shock." The sound of sirens grew louder in the distance, multiple units responding to what dispatch had logged as an officer down call. Marcus released his grip on both men, stepping back with his hands clearly visible as he positioned himself protectively over his father's prone form. Mitchell and Chen scrambled to their feet, their faces red with embarrassment and rage, their authority shattered as completely as glass striking concrete. "You're under arrest for assaulting police officers," Mitchell shouted, his voice cracking with humiliation and frustrated rage. His hand moved toward his radio, but something in Marcus's expression made him reconsider the wisdom of calling for backup while standing in front of 20 witnesses who had recorded his brutalization of an elderly man. Marcus pulled out his wallet with deliberate slowness, extracting a military identification card that he held up for both officers to see. "Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Harris, United States Army Special Operations Command," he announced, his voice carrying across the street with perfect clarity. "I am currently on authorized leave visiting my father, who was apparently assaulted by 2 individuals impersonating peace officers." The effect of this revelation rippled through the crowd like a stone dropped in still water. Neighbors who had remained silent during Theodore's brutalization suddenly found their voices, calling out confirmations of what they had witnessed. Mrs. Patterson, still clutching her pearls, stepped forward with the righteous indignation of someone whose worldview had been fundamentally challenged. "These men attacked Mr. Harris without provocation," she announced to anyone within hearing distance. "He was simply watering his roses when they arrived and began making unreasonable demands. I saw the entire incident from my kitchen window." Her voice carried the authority of someone who had chaired the neighborhood watch committee for 8 consecutive years. The first police cruiser arrived with lights flashing and siren wailing, followed quickly by 2 more units and an ambulance. Real police officers. trained professionals who understood the difference between law enforcement and authorized bullying, took in the scene with the rapid assessment skills that came from years of experience, separating truth from fiction in chaotic situations. Sergeant Linda Rodriguez, a 20-year veteran of the force, emerged from the lead vehicle with the confident bearing of someone who had seen every possible variation of human stupidity and violence. Her eyes swept the scene, taking in Theodore's prone form, the positioning of the crowd, and the body language of everyone present in less than 30 seconds. She had formed a preliminary assessment that would prove remarkably accurate. "Paramedics to the elderly gentleman immediately," she commanded, her voice cutting through the residual chaos with professional authority. "Everyone else step back and give them room to work." She approached Marcus with the careful respect of one professional evaluating another, her hand resting casually on her service weapon, but making no threatening gestures. Marcus handed over his military identification without being asked, his movements slow and deliberate to avoid any misunderstandings. "Sergeant, my father was attacked by these two men while watering his garden," he said, his voice carrying the controlled emotion of someone struggling to maintain professional composure. "Multiple neighbors recorded the incident, and I believe you'll find clear evidence of excessive force and assault." The paramedics worked over Theodore with efficient urgency, their hands moving with practiced precision as they assessed his condition and prepared him for transport. His heartbeat was irregular, his blood pressure dangerously elevated, and his oxygen saturation levels indicated potential cardiac compromise. The lead paramedic, a woman in her 40s, with kind eyes and gentle hands, spoke to him in soothing tones as she prepared an IV line. Mitchell and Chen stood off to one side, their earlier bravado replaced by the growing realization that their careers, and possibly their freedom, hung in the balance. Chen's face had gone pale as he calculated the potential consequences of their actions, while Mitchell maintained his defiant posture, but with considerably less conviction than he had demonstrated earlier. Maria Santos approached Sergeant Rodriguez with her phone still in hand, the video evidence of the entire incident preserved in digital clarity. "Officer, I recorded everything that happened," she said, her voice steady, despite the emotional toll of witnessing such brutality. "These men tasered Mr. Harris multiple times while he was on the ground complying with their orders. It was completely unprovoked." Additional witnesses came forward with their own recordings, creating a comprehensive digital record of the incident from multiple angles. Tom Bradley, who had watched from his porch without intervening, now stepped forward with uncharacteristic courage, perhaps motivated by guilt over his earlier inaction. "Sergeant, I saw the whole thing," he announced. "Those HOA officers attacked Mr. Harris without justification. He was just watering his flowers." Theodore Harris was loaded into the ambulance with gentle efficiency, his vital signs stabilized, but still concerning. Marcus climbed into the vehicle beside the stretcher, his large frame folding into the confined space with practiced ease. His father's eyes fluttered open as the ambulance doors closed, struggling to focus on his son's face through the haze of pain and medication. "Marcus." Theodore's voice was barely a whisper, but his son leaned close to catch every word. "The roses. Don't let them destroy the roses." Even in his moment of greatest vulnerability, facing the possibility of his own mortality, Theodore Harris's thoughts turned to the beauty he had spent so many years nurturing. The ambulance pulled away with lights flashing and siren wailing, carrying a man whose only crime had been existing in his own garden, while black behind them. The crime scene took on the organized chaos of a major investigation, with real police officers interviewing witnesses, collecting evidence, and building the case that would eventually bring Mitchell and Chen to justice. At Mercy General Hospital, Theodore Harris was rushed into the cardiac unit where Dr. Sarah Chen, no relation to the HOA officer, worked with her team to stabilize his condition. The electrical shocks had triggered a dangerous arrhythmia, and the stress of the assault had elevated his blood pressure to stroke levels. Marcus paced the waiting room like a caged predator, his military training warring with his filial love in ways that threatened to tear him apart. News of the incident spread through social media with the viral intensity of a digital wildfire. Maria's video, posted to Facebook with a simple caption explaining what had happened, was shared thousands of times within the first hour. Local news stations picked up the story, then national outlets, and by evening the hashtag #Justice for Theodore was trending across multiple platforms. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Veterans organizations demanded accountability for the assault on a retired educator. Civil rights groups called for federal intervention in what they characterized as a clear case of racially motivated police brutality. Even conservative commentators, typically supportive of law enforcement, struggled to defend actions so clearly indefensible when captured on video from multiple angles. District Attorney Margaret Walsh received her first call about the incident at 3:15 p.m., less than 6 hours after the assault. By 7 p.m., her office had viewed all available video evidence and begun preparing charges. The case was so clear-cut, the evidence so overwhelming, that prosecution became not a question of if, but rather how severe the charges would be. Marcus remained at his father's bedside through the night, watching monitors that tracked every heartbeat and breathing pattern. Theodore's condition gradually stabilized, but the doctors warned that full recovery would depend on factors beyond their control, including his will to fight and his body's ability to recover from the trauma it had endured. The morning brought protesters to the steps of the county courthouse, demanding justice for Theodore Harris and accountability for the HOA enforcement program that had enabled such brutality. Veterans in dress uniforms stood alongside civil rights activists, their shared outrage creating an unlikely but powerful coalition. The crowd grew throughout the day, fed by social media organizing and the simple human response to witnessing injustice. Mitchell and Chen were arrested at their homes before dawn, charged with aggravated assault, excessive force, and violation of civil rights under color of authority. Their perp walks were captured by news cameras and broadcast across the nation, their faces becoming symbols of institutional racism and the abuse of power that corrupted even the smallest forms of authority. The trial, when it came 6 months later, lasted only 3 days. The video evidence was so compelling, the witness testimony so consistent, and the defendant's actions so clearly indefensible that the jury deliberated for less than 2 hours before returning guilty verdicts on all charges. Mitchell received 8 years in federal prison. Chen, as the junior partner, received 5 years with the possibility of parole after 3. Theodore Harris recovered from his physical injuries, though his faith in the justice system would never fully heal. He returned to his roses with the same dedication he had always shown. But now, his garden served as more than just a source of personal joy. It became a symbol of resilience, of the human capacity to create beauty in the face of hatred, of the quiet dignity that no amount of brutality could destroy. The HOA enforcement program was disbanded within a month of the incident, its authority revoked by emergency action of the county commissioners. New oversight mechanisms were put in place for all similar programs statewide, with mandatory body cameras, regular psychological evaluations, and strict protocols for the use of force. The changes came too late for Theodore Harris, but perhaps in time to prevent future tragedies. Marcus remained on extended leave to care for his father, though his military career would continue with new purpose. The incident had opened his eyes to battles being fought on American soil, conflicts that required different weapons, but no less courage than those he had faced overseas. He began speaking at police academies and community events, sharing lessons learned from a lifetime of service and a single, terrible morning when that service became deeply personal. The roses bloomed again that spring, more beautiful than ever. Theodore tended them each morning with the same care he had always shown. But now, neighbors often joined him, drawn by the story that had transformed a suburban garden into a symbol of hope. Children from the local elementary school, where he had once served as principal, came for lessons in gardening and life, learning that growth requires patience, nurturing, and the courage to continue planting seeds, even when the soil has been salted with tears. Maria Santos became an unlikely activist, her video evidence having sparked a national conversation about accountability and justice. She testified before Congress about the importance of civilian oversight and the power of technology to expose truth in an age of institutional lies. Her phone, which had captured those crucial minutes of brutality, was eventually donated to the Smithsonian as part of an exhibit on civil rights in the digital age. The settlement that eventually came from the HOA and the county was substantial. But Theodore donated most of it to establish a scholarship fund for underprivileged students pursuing careers in education. The Theodore Harris Education Foundation would go on to fund hundreds of teachers, spreading his influence far beyond the classroom where he had once shaped young minds with patience and love. Years later, when Marcus was promoted to full colonel and assigned to lead a new program training Special Operations Forces in de-escalation techniques, he would often think about that terrible morning when his two worlds collided, the lessons learned in his father's garden, about dignity and restraint, and the difference between power and authority, became central to his teaching. His students learned not just how to eliminate threats, but how to recognize when the real threat came from within their own ranks. The neighborhood of Willowbrook Gardens changed as well, its reputation forever altered by the events of that spring morning. Property values initially declined as the story of Theodore Harris became national news. But they recovered stronger than before as families seeking genuine community moved in to replace those who fled when their assumptions about safety and privilege were challenged by reality. Theodore Harris lived to see his 81st birthday, surrounded by roses and friends and the kind of justice that comes not from courtrooms, but from hearts changed by witnessing courage in the face of hatred. His garden became a pilgrimage site of sorts, visited by people from across the country who came to see where an elderly man's dignity had triumphed over institutional brutality, where beauty had grown from soil salted with injustice. On quiet mornings, when the sun slanted through the rose bushes and cast shadows on earth that had been consecrated by suffering and redemption, Theodore would sometimes pause in his gardening to remember that terrible day when his son had arrived like an avenging angel to demand justice for his father. The roses bloomed as they always had, but now they carried new meaning. Their beauty, a testament to the human capacity to transform pain into purpose, brutality into grace, and individual tragedy into collective awakening. The story of Theodore Harris and his son Marcus became more than just another tale of police brutality and racial injustice. It became a parable about the power of witnesses, the importance of courage, and the way that love can manifest as righteous anger when those we protect are threatened by forces that should serve justice, but instead serve only themselves. In gardens across America, people planted roses in memory of a man who had simply wanted to nurture beauty and found himself fighting for his life, because others could not see past the color of his skin to the content of his character. And in the end, perhaps that was Theodore Harris's greatest victory, not the punishment of those who had wronged him, not the changes in policy that followed his suffering, but the simple fact that his story had opened eyes and hearts to truths that had always existed but had been too painful for comfort to acknowledge. His roses bloomed eternal, their beauty a living reminder that justice, like any growing thing, requires constant tending, protection from those who would destroy it, and the patient faith that spring will always follow winter, no matter how long or bitter the cold.